Hello, it is Virgil here. And so this is meant to be a brief documentary or simplification of the history of the Afrikaners / boers of South Africa. Them being the Africans of Dutch descent, the white South Africans. Now, the Dutch East India Company would establish the Cape Colony in 1652 not as a permanent settlement, but instead as a refreshment outpost to help the sailors going from the Netherlands to the Indies recuperate. It has to be noted that before then, the Portuguese did sail around this area, but they didn't fully expand their interests within the region and thus never got anything out of it. But in 1651, Jan van Riebeck, aboard the Dromedary, arrived in 1652 on the Cape of South Africa, the Cape Colony, and would help establish the Dutch presence there. As within the time he was there, they would begin expanding the region, which would eventually become a full-fledged colony, but for now is just an outpost and is not permanent, like many former Dutch colonies. So, in 1657, farming lands were allowed, so as people's contracts ended, so they were allowed to start farming the land in South Africa. And here is Jan van Riebeck, and this is meant to show that the Dutch are starting to arrive in South Africa. So, the Dutch presence is growing within South Africa, so much so that they come in conflict with the Khoi, which are natives of the area, and in the Khoi Dutch War from 1659 to 1660 would result in a Dutch victory, allowing them to get further inland and would allow them to grow the colony. As in the 1660s, the colony would grow as well as expand its farming and economic opportunities. But this would cause Riebeck to come in conflict with the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, which is the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, and as they were blaming him of establishing a permanent settlement, which he was not allowed to do, nor was he permitted. But in the 1670s, the VOC would actually finally commit to it becoming a full-on permanent colony, as this was mostly due to the growing interest of the British and French in the region, as it is a very strategic region in the south in South Africa, as it is one of the only ways you can get supplies from Europe to India without having to deal with more problems. In 1795, however, the British would invade Cape Town, the Cape Colony, as they were at war with France, and would occupy the region until 1803, in which they would turn the land back to the Dutch. But in 1806, the British would begin their permanent takeover of the land, and this is the greatest extent of the Dutch lands in South Africa at the time. So, with this, the now Afrikaners and Boers of South Africa are beginning to grow their unrest because of the British rule. This would cause them to begin something that would be pretty big. That being, the Great Trek, which would be to help establish their own independent and free states, free from British rule. And this would cause a mass migration of Boers inward as they would begin to establish states like the Republic of South Africa, or Transvaal, and the Orange Free State, as well as others, but those would be taken over the Brits, and these two are the main ones that would also cause problems for the Brits in the future. Because the Great Trek, or Boer Trek, lasted from 1835 to 1846, as they would come in conflict with the natives that had moved southwards, and having the superior technology, they would be able to win and get these lands. And it would stay relatively peaceful for a while. That is until the British started growing their interests in in these new Dutch republics, or Boer republics, as they are now separating themselves from the Dutch, as the Dutch have abandoned them. Now, in 1877, the British would actually annex Transvaal. This was due to Transvaal having a bunch of inner turmoil with its economic situation. But the people did not agree with this decision and were disagreed with the annexation, and would attempt to have this be repealed. It wouldn't, however, and even the president at the time disagreed. Well, former president of Transvaal agreed that it shouldn't have happened and that it should still be independent. But there would be no real fights at the beginning. But because of Shepstone, the new British man in charge of the region of Transvaal by the government, he would be incompetent with his work in not allowing much to happen in favor of the Boers, as well as not allowing the autonomy they wanted. It would cause them to revolt. And the British thought they were going to win this war, as they had heavily underestimated the Boers. But the Boers would fight very hard against the Brits, and due to them having similar weaponry and similar technology, they were able, as well as knowledge of the region, they were able to fight back the Brits in the First Boer War. In the treaty, they would actually in the war, they would actually win and regain their independence, as it would be recognized by the British, as well as the Queen Victoria. And Transvaal would actually become the South African Republic, fully recognized by the London Convention, which happened. And one thing to note was a battle at Majuba would be similar to Texas with its Alamo, as it became a sort of saying in the Second Boer War to say, remember Majuba. Now, the British would not stop their interests in these two Boer republics because of the growing amount of resources, that being gold. Very expensive and very, very useful. Now, this would cause, as well as the gold having caused a growing minority of Wheatlanders, or people from across the globe wanting to invest in the region, even disregarding the fact that they didn't care about not having voting rights within the region. Now, this is about time I mention someone who is very well known in this time period, that being Cecil Rhodes, who became Premier of Cape Colony. And he wanted to confederate the lands of South Africa with the Boer republics, likely due to the money, as well as the growing want for a transcontinental railroad, Cape to Cairo. And they would attempt to pull off something called the Jameson Raid. Now, this was supposed to spark an uprising between the Wheatlanders to rise up against the Boer republics. It did not end up working out well, as they didn't care much. And so this caused the South African republic's president at the time, Kruger, to not like this, and so he sent several proposals to the British in order to have more peace between the two. Both would be rejected. And so he sent an ultimatum for the British to remove and withdraw all their units from the borders, as well as any garrisons going to South Africa, or, the Cape Colony. This would be denied as well, thus causing them to start sieging down nearby towns. The Boers, that is. And so the Second Boer War begins. The Second Boer War, as with the first one, started out with a bunch of Dutch, Afrikaner victories, as they knew the region well, and due to the fact that the British were caught off guard. Now, the British would suffer humiliation after humiliation continuously, even being, the Dutch having less equipment. They had really good leaders like Jan Smuts, who were really good generals at the time. But the British would be able to turn things around as they had more resources, and more people volunteered to actually fight in this war from the homeland. And this would cause the British to start pushing the Boers back, as well as causing the first known instances of what we could eventually call today concentration camps, as women and children were placed in them to try and get the men of the war to back down finally, as they were currently initiating guerrilla warfare against the Brits, even after both republics had been fully annexed, and there was not much of a government left. And this would cause 28,000 deaths in these camps of the Boer population. They would also burn farms, as that would hurt the Boers economically, and this all ended in 1902, the war having begun in 1899. And so, thus ends a brutal war. And they would be separate entities for the time, ruled by the British, until 1910, in which it would finally confederate into the Union of South Africa. Now, if you're wondering why Namibia is there, it's because it would be controlled after World War I, but after World War I, they would release in Namibia. But for a time, the Union of South Africa did hold Namibia. So, the Union of South Africa would bring about, an actual state there that wasn't just a colonial government at the time. And so political parties and voting were allowed within the state, and became pretty big as the Boer nationalist, Afrikaner nationalist party, the National Party, would form as an opposition to the English government in place. Now, the Union of South Africa didn't have much going on, as most of its history at this point turns into British history, because they would join in World War I and World War II. Though, one thing to note in World War I was the Maritz Rebellion, which didn't last long and was not too popular, as it was caused by the start of World War I and then the Boers wanting independence again, but failing very quickly this time. Now, the big thing that happened with the Union of South Africa was after World War II, that being the implementation of apartheid in 1948, which was supported by the National Party. As, well, we know, apartheid was a horrible time in which, well, I'm not here to make political statements, but it was still horrible mistreatment of the population. As it was a minority ruling a majority, as it was a minority white ruling a majority black country, even with the Boers and English not having the best of relationships with each other. Apartheid, though, would end in 1991, and thus ends the power of the Boers within the state of South Africa, as it became the Republic of South Africa and has a completely different flag. The first flag had the Dutch colors of orange, white, and blue, which were one of the older Dutch colors, as the Dutch colors of the flag would become red, white, and blue. And the flag next to it, the now Republic of South Africa flag, has much more African colors, those being the yellow, green, and black. And so that ends the history of the Boers having any influence with their state, as they are a minority and are very commonly not doing the best at the moment, as South Africa itself is not that much of a stable state. The best example of South African Boers, it would be to go to the community of Orania, which is mostly Boer or Afrikaner. This thus ends this very short simplification of the history of South Africa and, well, the history more so of the Boers and the Afrikaner people of the state. Thank you. Goodbye.